Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us again this evening for another episode with Professor Bolaji Akinyemi. Prof, you are welcome to the program this evening.
Thank you very much. And let me seize this opportunity to apologize to our viewers for my inability to be personally present last week due to circumstances beyond my control.
All right, thank you, Prof. Glad to have you back. Prof, let's start today talking about the G7 meeting that took place this week and to look at the relevance of G7 to some of the issues we have going on in the world today. Some have said G7 is probably starting to lose its relevance with the rise of China. What is your take on this, Prof?
Well, um, the G7 basically is an alliance of the Western Bloc um, extended to Australia, um, and what have you. It's not more than that. I think it is a pity that South Africa was invited and it accepted the invitation. Because what the United States is trying to do is to consolidate um, um, its position in the Western Bloc, uh, representing the old world order. Um, and where they are going to identify China and Russia as protagonists in the miasma of the down spiraling Western order and the upcoming new world order. And I don't think that third world countries should get themselves crushed in the middle by identifying with the G7, and perhaps when the new boys on the block, China and Russia, decide to hold their own meeting, they are then going to also pull some of the third world countries, like perhaps countries in the ASEAN bloc, uh, to themselves, and immediately those are put to themselves, those are now perceived as being anti-Western bloc. Number one, I wouldn't want to see African power, powerhouses caught in the competition between the two. And basically, I wouldn't like to see countries, even in Western Europe. The EU, for example, is not there. And will the EU now be forced to make a choice between the outgoing world order and the incoming new world order? I'm not sure the EU itself, even though there are members who are in NATO, will want that kind of configuration. And definitely, I wouldn't want African countries to get themselves embedded in in what is going to be a resurgence of the Cold War. And if you cast your mind back, this is actually what led to the non-aligned movement. And since really, international politics, as Hans Mergenthal has put it, is a power play. Um, there is very little room for moral values in defining or operationalizing international politics. It's a power play. And the moment you have one power bloc associated with the West, with the G7 is, and another power bloc associated with the incoming world order, which will be China and Russia, to avoid being caught in the middle, you then have to start coming up with some formulations. And this is where, in a way, the concept of medium power comes in, given the fact that the European Union is basically Western civilization, but which wants to avoid is being locked into the old world order. And some of the power blocks in Africa also not wanting to be locked into the power blocks of either the West or the East. You now start talking about a constellation of middle level power countries that can then serve as a mediator between the East and the West. So, I mean, there are different, configurations that you can play with. But I think that the G7 should not make the mistake of putting itself up as a defender of a universal world order. The time is long gone since if America coughs, the rest of us catch a cold. If they do that, they will be overstretching themselves. Let the G7 be what it is, a Western bloc.
Prof, there's a point you mentioned there that I want to drill in on a little bit. And this is the fact that the EU was not represented as part of the G7. Because earlier on this week, there was this noise that was being raised where the UK was rejecting full diplomatic status to the EU ambassador. What is your take on that point, Prof?
Um, we're starting to see the unforeseen consequences of Brexit. Will you believe it? That as we are talking now, the British Navy and the French Navy are eyeball to eyeball in New Jersey Island over fishery, the presence of the competition between British fishermen and French fishermen. Would you believe, and both, by the way, are members of NATO, but they're about to have a naval clash in that sea in between France and Britain. This would not have happened last year or the year before, but people probably who thought deeply could have predicted that this was going to happen, even though I said this is one of the unpredictable consequences. And there are going to be several more like that as Britain and the EU go eyeball to eyeball. So what you've drawn attention to is the nitty-gritty of the disengagement and what it then will represent, or the conundrum, the diplomatic conundrum that the EU and Britain will have to go through. And I'm afraid that Britain is just overreaching itself. British GDP and British outreach is not going to match the European Union GDP or the European Union outreach. When it comes, Britain is just going to be batting above its capability in this kind of situations. If France cuts off the power supply and blocks the sale of British fishery catch into France, who is going to be the loser? How will Britain retaliate? And when it retaliates, what is also then going to be the counterpunch from France? So I'm afraid that Brexit was ill thought about. Let's just put it simply like that.
Prof, I'm going to drill into another point you've raised there. The response of the British government in sending naval ships out there, was it too quick of them and of France to also respond in kind? Was it too quick of both countries getting to that level of escalation?
Well, you see, the British government under Boris Johnson has acted like a bully. I mean, frankly, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of Britain, acts like a bully. He wants to position his image a la Winston Churchill, without having the political muscle of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill had, solid backing of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland behind him. Even right now, so we're talking, Scotland is saying it wants to have another referendum, whether it will continue to be part of the United Kingdom. So Boris Johnson may end up as the Prime Minister who not only built an artificial wall between the United Kingdom and Europe, he may end up as a Prime Minister who dismembered the United Kingdom. But if he thinks he can bully the European Union, I think he will be overrating the popularity of the United Kingdom amongst the European nations.
Prof, there's a question on YouTube here that I want to put to you. This person is saying that doesn't it seem that the developing countries in Africa have put themselves more closely with the Chinese, given the debt profile we're seeing across many African nations? What's your take on that, Prof?
Well, let's just say that the economic relationship between African countries and China, number one, will make, and that's why I said, will make it impossible for African power blocks to be associated with the G7 plus plus plus. And that's why I said even the presence of South Africa in this meeting in London is again another ill thought of move, diplomatic move by both the G7 and South Africa itself. And number two, that economic relations between China and Africa would seem to pull the African countries towards China, but I don't believe that given the ingrained tendency of African diplomacy to be anti-blocks, I still believe that there is time on on the part of the African countries to separate their economic relations with China from being hooked into a Chinese bloc. I know that there is every year, I think there is a meeting of the African heads of state who are marched into China to shake hands with the Chinese president. I object to that. I don't think that there is any justification for the annual Chinese African Summit. And having seen what it can lead to, which is African countries being now positioned into an anti-West diplomatic status. I think the African countries themselves should, number one, put a stop to the annual summit with the Chinese, and two, try to now, along with maybe the EU, form, if you like, a third bloc, back to the concept of medium powers, a third bloc that will neither be pro-Chinese or anti-Chinese, not pro-G7 and not anti-G7.
Prof, thanks for that. Before we leave the G7 topic, one of the things that came out, one of the communiques that came out, in the communique that came out, they talked about uh, obviously siding with Ukraine, and what was going on in Ukraine there, and the fact that they really went all out to talk to China and Russia, and in some case almost referred to them, painting them as malicious. Did you expect them to come out with something that was positive in what China was doing, or something positive in what Russia was doing?
No, that's not surprising to me. And it reinforces the point I was trying to make, that the G7 was actually designed to for America to rally around people who share its vision of a world order. Um, and this vision is based on, if you like, human rights, democracy, a free press, which immediately targets the Chinese and the Russians as protagonists. You can't beat around the bush. And if you followed what has been going on, even from the time of Trump, the Chinese have said they want, and the Russians, that they want multilateralism rather than unilateralism. Multilateralism means that there will be a world order based on concrete, shared, universal values. You don't interfere in my domestic affairs. I don't interfere in your domestic affairs. But if you are going to target me, I also can target you. And I'm not surprised that at that confrontational meeting between the United States Secretary of State and the Chinese Foreign Minister, and what it needs to do about civil rights in the United States. And the moment you also start pushing back at Russia, Russia will also push back at you. So, really, what the Chinese and the Russians are saying is, let us find common values on which we can build a new world order. On the table, the Chinese are saying, we don't want you to interfere in our human rights. On the table, the Americans are saying, from our side is human rights and democracy that we are bringing to the table. You are then going to have, you know, discussions and compromises which will not emphasize the values of one bloc as against the values of the other bloc. So I'm not surprised that this communique stresses an anti-Chinese and an anti-Russian position, because that is really what can hold the G7 together.
Thank you for that, Prof. Prof, before we go to the next topic on the ICC judgment that was released today, we'll take a short break and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the ICC judgment that came out and your views. We'd like to hear your views on that, Prof. But we'll take a short break before that. Welcome back. Prof, today we heard the news of the ICC sentencing to 25 years the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army, the Ugandan. What is your take on that sentence, Prof?
Well, let me start off by making something absolutely clear. The Lord's Resistance Army was a vicious army. Nothing about it should recommend it to anybody who has regard for human life, for human dignity. And the Lord Resistance Army stands to be condemned roundly. Having said that, let me also make it clear, I am opposed to the judgment of the International Criminal Court. Here was a man who was kidnapped from his family at the age of 9, kept under their control. He tried to run away. They recaptured him, and as punishment, they made him to skin alive a child. As his punishment, they made him to skin alive a child. And gradually, he just became one, I suppose he lost all hope of escaping again. And he just became one of them. And instead of sending him to a home where they can work on him to rehabilitate him, uh, you sentence him to 25 years. Would they treat a white soldier that way? We know what Western soldiers did in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Uh, my memory is still alive, not with the sound of music, but with what American soldiers did in Vietnam. How many of them got 1 year in jail? And you're sentencing this man to 25 years in jail. It allowed Western judges to put on, I suppose, a garb of righteousness to crucify this man again. He was crucified when he was 9 years old, captured. He was crucified when he was made as punishment to skin alive a child. He had no choice. He was made to do it. And you still expect this man to remain sane, and his punishment for going insane. Because to me, having been made to do all these things, insanity was probably the only way psychologically that he could then survive. And then you sentence him to 25 years. Frankly, those judges need to have their heads examined. And this is the kind of thing that makes the International Criminal Court to be accused of being, frankly, anti-Black, anti-African. It will not have passed this sentence on an American soldier who's gone crazy, or a British soldier who's gone bananas, given the pressure of war. I totally disagree with this judgment. I totally disagree with this judgment. I think this unfortunate man is just being crucified all over again.
Thank you for that, Prof. Let's move to the United States, and then we'll come back to Europe. Um, 100 days of President Biden. How would you rate him, Prof?
I think I will give him an A plus plus. For one, keeping faith with the promises he made during the campaign. Two, having a grand vision of the United States that is worth having if you are going to resurrect the United States from being a country that has fallen short, whether of health standards, educational standards, human rights standards. They're probably the only area where America has kept its strength as a great nation has been militarily. America is still number one militarily in the world. But in its health facilities, its infrastructural facilities, railway, roads have all decayed, and no attention has been paid to it. And true to its own values, he has stuck his neck out, come up with an infrastructural bill, and he has defined that infrastructural bill not just in terms of roads and railways. He's defined it also in terms of educational, social, and health. indices to bring America back to being great, not just in terms of militarily, but on all these other parameters. He's addressed them. He has his own way of, he's a preacher in the way, and I think America, he knows how to use the White House as a bully pulpit to address Americans, but to use a language which I think, you sit down before a campfire, you talk to a group of young men, young women, and they understand why you need to do these things, rather than, couching them in some ideological uh, schism that you may not even be able to reach across to the people you are talking to. All of this within 100 days, I think he has my admiration for his courage, for his consistency. He's probably not going to get, of course, given the fact that his margin of victory in, in Congress is very narrow. And unlike his margin of victory in terms of the popular vote, he's going to have to compromise. But I think he finally got the message that he doesn't have enough time, because he cannot guarantee what will happen in the midterm elections. That there's something you can call uh, uh, the second term syndrome, or if you like, the second term curse, where a head of state or politicians will say, well, during the first term, I will just consolidate. When I come back the second term, right, that's when you will see me in action. And then you lose the election. There's no second term, no new other opportunity to now keep your promises. I think Biden has learned his lesson, and he probably knows he has 2 years to convince America that there can be a future for the United States, a future where the United States, even though it will not be the only superpower in the world, but the United States will still be a great nation. Greatness being defined in terms of the standard of living of its people, standard of living of its cities, standard of living or in human rights or in civil rights, and all that kind of thing. Time that he doesn't have the whole time to persuade America to be great again. He's done very well. During this 100 days, he's done very well.
Prof, on that point, there's something that has also come up, and this is looking at the debt profile of the United States. That number is $28 trillion and going a little bit more. And there's the fear that they might even hit that debt ceiling very soon. Some people are saying, is it right for him to then still go on this huge $1 trillion spending spree that he's gone on to try to support the economy? What's your take on that?
Well, I will have to depend on the comment or the position of his Treasury Secretary, who is a seasoned banker, and who's argued that actually, I mean, of course, she's a Keynesian, and the Keynesian theory is you spend your way out of a recession. Um, the more projects you have on the table, the more employment you provide for the people who are going to implement this project. The more employment you get in, the more the tax base expands, and you can then bring in more money, and that money can reduce your the debt that you accumulate, especially if it's not just the poor and the middle class you tax, but you tax also the big corporations, those who own the wealth of America. You'll be able to ask them to pay their fair share. So presumably, they that if they will be able to pull it off and not go bankrupt. Uh, you pick an example from FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, during the big depression of the 30s. That we are spending money to pull America out of the depression. And I think that this is what motivates President Biden. Um, Obviously, he's a Keynesian as well, rather than the economic theories of Reagan and Margaret Thatcher that believed in trickle down uh, economy, and which Biden says never gets you out of debt.
Hmm. Thank you for that, Prof. Let's go to the Middle East and let's talk about Israel, Prof. Benjamin Netanyahu has failed to build a new government. And now it's gone to the right to do that, has gone to the opposition. What is your take on that, Prof? Do you see this being a major issue if Netanyahu doesn't come back as the president, as the prime minister? Excuse me.
Hmm. Well, look, I have stopped trying to understand the politics of Israel. I just stopped. I find it confusing. I find it ununderstandable. Um, Maybe the Israelis believing that they are really, you know, God's chosen people, believe that they can get away with behaving irrationally. How many elections have they had in 2 years? Four. And you know what the definition of insanity is? Doing the same thing and anticipating different results. And what Israel political system has just proved is that you cannot continue to do the same thing and expect different results. So they've always had four hung elections where nobody gets a majority in parliament, and whoever there has a plurality, you now start trying to negotiate with people at times who have only 3 seats or 5 seats, just in order to cobble together uh, uh, um, a majority, which then is not stable. Uh, I don't know when the Israelis are going to learn their lesson, that they just have to make up their mind. And if their mind is that they will have to continue to be hung elections in Israel, we don't know where that's going to get the Israelis. Fortunately for them, they get being bailed out by the United States, that has economic problems of its own, But because of the nature of the domestic politics in the United States, cannot abandon Israel to its own folly. Um, it's incredible. I mean, it's just incredible. I cannot explain it. And I don't think there's anybody who tells you he can explain away the irrationality of Israeli politics doesn't know what he's talking about.
Prof, let's focus this last session of the program on COVID-19. There's quite a lot that has been coming out across the different countries. But let's start with India and what is happening in India on COVID. Um, what is your take there, Prof?
Let me start off by extending my sympathy towards the Indians. Um, we not only are we all human beings, but they are also leading members of the non-aligned movement. And one, I mean, the humanity in any person will not allow him to sit there and see what India is going through without joining them in shedding tears. Having said this, I cannot but refrain from calling out the Indians themselves, not just their government alone, but the Indians themselves, who seems to have gone on a wild spree of exceptionalism, that they were prepared to tell the world they are so exceptional that they've conquered COVID-19. And how did they decide to taunt the world? It was by indulging in one, political rallies, a reckless behavior by their prime minister, political rallies to celebrate their conquest of COVID-19, and that it was done by their government. Mega rallies. And then number two, the Hindu religious festival, which amounted to, if you like, mega rallies in water. And now they are paying a price for it. I just pray and hope that not only will India learn a lesson from this, but all of us will learn a lesson for premature judgment in taunting our nose at not only this pandemic, but at any other pandemics that nature throws at us. People don't listen. They don't want to reason when they think, when they're even behaving irrationally. I mean, is it rocket science to have told the Indians, don't have these mega rallies, don't have this Hindu festival of jumping into water as like mass lemons? I mean, so it's a consequence of believing one's exceptionalism that is often based on nothing but arrogance. Um, by any means, we haven't conquered this pandemic. We haven't conquered this COVID-19. Right? I mean, after all the vaccines that we are using were actually given emergency approval. It's not as if we even know the consequences of the vaccines we are using. But it was that if we don't use the vaccines, the penalty will be more than what the consequences of using the vaccine may be. So I hope that we all calm down. We will all move back from vaccine nationalism, uh, where again it is obvious, and this is a message for the important countries, the superpowers in the world, whether China, Russia, America, Britain, EU, or whatever have it, until all of us are immune from this COVID-19, nobody is safe from it. It has shown a capability to jump frontiers. It has shown a capability to metamorphose into different variants, and each variant being more vicious than where it is coming from. Um, and so I thought it is perfectly clear that this is not the time to play economic arrogance. It is the taxpayers' money that allowed um, um, that allowed multinational companies to develop these vaccines at such a short pace. Taxpayers' money pumped into this. And yet now they are building up a resistance against sharing this vaccine 19, its manufacture and its development with any country that has the capability to do so. I'm not piling all of this on the head of uh, import of developed or high income countries. Believe me, I know countries in the third world which, if they only stop stealing their own money, could have pumped this money into factories that could have developed vaccines. But there are politicians, there are presidents, senators, what have you, steal the budget and steal their country dry. And then at the top of their voice, they call on the Western countries to rescue them. I think we should call out the deficiencies in the governance of third world countries, while at the same time we are telling the developed countries that it is short-sighted to play not only economic nationalism, but vaccine nationalism itself. I think they should simply tell these corporations that it is the people's money that was used to develop this, and therefore, at the meeting that's going to be held at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, they should all rally around resolution that will allow for sharing, forget profits, but sharing the technology with developing countries that have the capability, and let us say how we can rescue the whole world and not just rescue particular countries on the altar that multinationals must make money.
Prof, there's a point I want to put to you to get your reaction to it, and this is the fact that the WHO, backed by Germany, are now setting up a global hub to help the world deal with the next pandemic. Are they doing this too soon? COVID is not over yet. We've just talked about what's happening in India and how that could spread to something much bigger. And now you're already talking about the next pandemic. Is this them signaling that let's now move on from COVID?
No, I don't think so. And if they are motivated by that, they will soon come crashing down to the earth when COVID-19 strikes back. No, I just think that there are lessons already to be learned from perhaps the deficiencies in the way in which we handled COVID-19. And that perhaps, this is the time then to see how we can build on the lessons for the next one. Because after all, we don't know what the next one will be. All scientists agree upon is that there's going to be another big one that is going to come. Um, um, I expect that they will then start talking about, they need to continue to spend money on the health and social welfare sectors, stockpiling things we found deficient uh, uh, when this COVID-19 first hit, assembling perhaps a college of scientists, virologists, who, will be looking out for signals, because signals were missed at the beginning of this COVID-19. And, things like that, and I hope that in picking on the scientists that will be assembled to monitor this thing, it will be universal scientists. We are not just going to concentrate on scientists from the West or Chinese scientists or Russian scientists. There are brilliant scientists, virologists from the third world who perhaps, in fact, because of the nature of the social health welfare systems in the third world, are probably even more sensitive. They've dealt with Ebola, they've dealt with whatever it is. They live in societies that interact with these animals, and therefore they know what to look for, rather than people sitting in Washington or London or Paris working in a laboratory. The society is the laboratory of third world virologists, and they have things to offer. That's the advice I will give. But I don't think it's too early for us to start thinking ahead and anticipating what may be coming.
Prof, one last question I want to put to you before we close this evening, and that's the point around Napoleon. Some have referred to him as a military genius and a national hero, while some have been very opposed to that. Um, what is your take on Napoleon? How should history remember Napoleon?
As a military genius, of course, um, as a military genius, um, uh, a man who was ahead of his time, in terms of, okay, he abolished slavery within France itself, but well, in dealing, however, with Haiti, showed that he also had shortcomings. But There is no country that I know of that does not appreciate its heroes. They still talk about Wellington. They still talk about all these big British war heroes. They still talk about in the United States. They go back to even the First World War, and tanks and ships and airplanes in the United States are named after their war heroes. So why shouldn't France, you know, appreciate the real world hero or that it has? I mean, all these other generals who, are get collecting medals in France over what they did to their colonies. Napoleon was not cut off from that line. He was a real world genius when it comes to military statistics. And if you go through the syllabus of a lot of military academies, they still teach, strategies laid down and used by Napoleon. And don't ever forget that the reason why Europe uses the civil law as against Britain that uses the common law is because of Napoleon. Because as he conquered country after country after country in Europe, he was laying down the legal system that he had used in France, and that had been successful. So till today, the civil law in Europe is thanks to Napoleon.
Thank you for that, Prof. And we have run out of time. But before we go, Prof, um, today is session 47, and we're almost coming to that 1 year anniversary of this program. And to our viewers who have been here all the while, thank you. But over the coming weeks, we're going to be looking back at the program. We're going to have guests who would be coming on the program talking about different issues around the world in the run up to our session 52, which will be the 1 year of this program. So there's a lot coming up in the coming weeks as you join us on the program. And Prof, that's it for this evening. Any final words from you before we go?
Watanga, peace, shalom.
Thank you. And bye to our viewers for now.